Welcome to Convini TV, where real estate is done differently. I'm Cameron Owens, CEO and co-founder, and I'm here with Greville Pabst, one of Melbourne's leading property advisors. Grev, would welcome your thoughts on what's happening in property management on a national basis. Any sort of trends, insights you can share with us today?
Thanks, Cameron. Yeah, look, property management's been a tough sort of place to play over the last 12 months, particularly with COVID and the moratoriums on evictions in some states finishing at the end of March this year. There's been a lot of people that were out living away from home. Their sons and daughters are coming back to live with mum and dad, and you've got the Airbnb situation. So a lot of people, investors, were using Airbnb, and that market now, the international tourists has disappeared, and so we're finding that those short-term stays, landlords are now converting them to try and into permanent stays, and so that's added to the supply of rental accommodation, which is, last year particularly, that had dire effects, around Australia on rents, vacancy rates. Yeah. But look, pleasingly, this year we've started to see, particularly houses, good houses are renting, very well, very strong at the moment. Yeah. We're still struggling with some of the inner city apartments, and particularly in Docklands and South Bank and the CBD, and in some suburban areas where there's a high percentage of apartments. So areas like West Melbourne, for example, Footscray, Broadmeadows, Clayton, Preston, where you have a high proliferation of high density apartments in those particular suburbs. We're seeing high vacancy rates there. But I suppose some of the there's been some legislative changes, Cameron, in some of the states. And in fact, in Victoria, there's 130 changes to the tenancy legislation, there are big changes. But I think overall they're relatively positive, and I think landlords now can no longer get away with not maintaining their properties, so they have to spend money on things like heating, cooling. If you've got mould, if you smoke detectors and things like that, landlords now can't get away with not spending any money on their rental properties. They have to spend money, and I suppose that's a segue into prop pay, and that you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely, because we hear that what you explained there ad nauseum, and what we're seeing is that there's sort of cash flow stresses with some landlords, and they're struggling to actually make those improvements, and they need to be done. It's a legislative requirement for them to do that. So what we're seeing happening in the market is that landlords and property managers are starting to gravitate towards the types of cash flow solutions or buy now, pay later products that we're providing, because it's convenient, it's simple, and allows them just to smooth out some of those expenses over up to 2 years, as opposed to having to find that capital up front. So that's kind of a trend that we're seeing. So we're absolutely hearing and seeing what you just discussed there.
Yeah, I think it's a great niche product because cash flow. A lot of landlords are strapped with cash flow at the moment, and to comply with these legislative requirements, they do need to spend money to update their premises to be in accordance with some of these changes to legislation.
Yeah, that's right. And even to protect the yield that they're getting on their property. So there's keeping it safe, meeting a legislative requirement, but then it's just actually to either keep the yield or grow the yield. The money needs to be invested. Grev, I'd love to get your thoughts on the value of investing in good marketing and presenting your home when it comes to putting your house on the market for sale.
Look, it's critical, Cameron. I'm often called in by my clients as and appointed as vendor's advocate. And so, you know, the first things that I'm looking at when I do the inspection of that house or apartment is that, you know, I'll have a bit of a dad's look, have a bit of a look around.
Yeah.
And sometimes there are things that we need to do before we present it for sale, and often before we appoint an agent. So things like, you know, painting, general handyman maintenance stuff. Quite often it's carpets that need to be replaced. Sometimes it's light fittings that need to be updated, or door handles and kitchen, bathroom, you know, fixtures. You know, really important, and it can make a huge difference. And sometimes it's $5,000, but sometimes it might be 10 or 15 or 20,000. Sometimes more. Yeah. But it's very important to get the house or the apartment presented, you know, well, so that when somebody comes through, it's going to attract a lot of interest.
Yeah. And do you invest? I guess you'd be telling your vendors to invest in styling and staging as well.
Look, almost every time, you know, we work with a number of stylists particularly in Melbourne, and like it just makes a huge difference.
Right.
Sometimes only for a few $100s. Look, sometimes the landlords, you know, the vendors, I should say, they have a lot of them have great taste. They've already got good furniture, but sometimes it's about supplementing what they already have with some nice pillows, or some nice light fittings, or some nice paintings. Yeah. And sometimes they're asset rich, but they're income poor, and sometimes they can't afford to spend that money to present the house the way that it should be. And so the product that you have, Cam, I think can really help a lot of those landlords.
Yeah, that's what we see. We see very much in the markets that we operate is that sometimes either vendors are choosing to use our ad fund product, which is essentially a buy now, pay later product when it comes to the marketing of your property, as a more convenient way to do it. And sometimes, as you described, some of the vendors that we support, they might be asset rich but cash poor, and it's a more convenient way to make those commitments come true. And
you can't, buyers aren't stupid, right? They can sniff if something's been done cheaply. And you have to not only present it, but you have to market it. Yeah. You have to market the property well, and you can't. There's no shortcuts for that. Yeah. And that does cost money. You've got to have a nice big 6 by 8 foot board, up on the front of the property. You've got to have good photography. You've got to invest in photography. You've got to have. REA is not cheap to advertise and put but all the eyeballs are on realestate.com and Domain. So you have to invest money on advertising in those areas. You can't skimp that, right? You can't sell a secret. So you have to spend that money, and this is something else that Convini can offer.
Absolutely. We naturally support the advertising expenses, as well as the styling and staging, as well as those maintenance. And again, we just see is like yourself is it's your most important asset. Why be cheap on marketing it and presenting it? It's super important, and our products can absolutely be a more convenient way to pay for those sorts of expenses.
Quite often I see a 1-to-3 ratio, Cam. You spend. I've seen people spend $100,000, and they've got $300,000 back when they sell. Yeah. So it is important. It does work, and it helps sell houses and apartments.
Yeah, that's so true. We more recently supported a fantastic vendor down in Mid-Zone, asset rich, cash poor. They invested a good amount of money in the presentation, in particular, making the place look far more presentable than it otherwise would. And they got in excess of $150,000 more than they would have if the house had been presented in its original state.
Good on you, Cam.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.